Hello and welcome to Mobile Interactions Now, the podcast where industry pros share first-hand experiences on making mobile interactions work. I'm Chris and I'm part of the team here at Tintech. On today's episode, we have the conclusion of our conversation with Pamela Clark-Dickson. So here is part 2 of our conversation with Pamela. Take it away, Jean.
Welcome back to the show, Pamela. In our previous episode, we talked about how digital experiences are changing on the consumer side. Today, I would like to talk about what that really means for the businesses and what they can do about. But first, out of the consumer trends we discussed in our previous episode, what would you say is the most important trend that brands must pay attention to, say, within the next 36 months or so?
So I think there's probably three key things that brands should be paying attention to. And the first is, it's probably not a new thing, but based on our research and knowing from that research that consumers are still sort of starting to build their use of chat apps and communication services, and that's growing. That's probably something that brands should be responding to if they haven't already, is making sure that they can, interact with their consumers on the various communications apps or chat app platforms. And this is probably more one for outside of those Asian markets of China and Japan and South Korea, where the communications apps already have this fairly much covered. So that essentially means looking at the Facebook group of apps, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp and Instagram, as well as Facebook itself, of course, but also Apple iMessage as well. So that would be one thing that I think brands will need to act on if they're not already doing so. And I think probably a large number of them are already present on some of these apps. I think the second one to keep an eye out on is, and this is related to the first in a sense, is Facebook Pay, which is their new wallet service. I think that if Facebook gets this up and running across all of its apps, for comms and social, I think that's going to, change the commerce landscape. Just simply because of the billions of users that are on each of these platforms. So if Facebook can move the conversation or the interaction between businesses and consumers on those apps from conversation to commerce, that's going to change the way I think that consumers, buy goods and services, and not just on a global scale. We're not talking like, for example, Amazon being used for consumers to buy services from places, from Amazon, for example. This is going to have local ramifications as well, because we have a lot of local businesses that are on Facebook pages, for example. So I think that, that could be something that will change, that brands need to look at as well. And then finally, just going back to the telco world again, we see that RCS, rich communication services, doesn't have the same reach. We don't see, too many, under 100 operators at the moment have launched RCS services, and of those, not many have launched A2P or application to person RCS, the business communications element of RCS. But on the other hand, there is an established SMS ecosystem there that telcos can use to build RCS on, and there is also a huge potential reach both through the telcos and also via the telcos working with Google for Android messages. So that's something that bears watching, at least in terms of whether, over the coming 36 months we start to see that becoming a more important telco service.
That's really interesting because, this whole going, as you mentioned, the conversations to commerce, to me, that kind of covers the entire customer journey now. Before we talked about the whole customer care use cases and all that. And if brands are really looking at it, whether their initial motivation was just adding another channel to do the same thing, but just reach, more people, or are they actually start looking at the entire journey because of this whole changing conversations into complete commerce interaction. Where we are at, and what do you think is happening now?
I do think that there is very much this move towards brands offering their customers a number of different channels to engage with, and that's again in response to the availability of those channels. So, for example, as I mentioned in the previous episode, we see that email and voice and SMS are still very important channels for consumers to interact with their service providers, with their brands. But others are coming and are being used. The communications apps, for example, web, obviously with or without an agent helping with web chat is also important. Lots of consumers like to be able to get online and actually chat within a brand's web page with an agent for different reasons, whether that's to do some troubleshooting or to order a service. So, and I think the reason, and again, it comes back to what I was saying in the previous episodes, if you make things easy for a consumer, if they can get access to a brand's web page and get access to a chat capability on that web page where they're speaking to a live agent, that's easy for them. It gets their problem solved, relatively quickly. The agent on the other end has access, through a verification process to all of the information about a customer without the customer actually having to give all of that information. So those sorts of things are, I think, are very potent capabilities for consumers. But just going back to our survey at the moment, I mean, we did do some we did ask the question about what do consumers use particular channels for, and we saw the results of that. For email, it's used for just about everything except for purchasing and payment. So, and that kind of makes sense. SMS is most used for receiving information and alerts and bill status reminders, less for two-way kind of use cases there. Voice tends to be less used than email and SMS for most use cases. The highest use would be receiving product advice. So again, consumers dialing into a helpline is what we're sort of seeing there. Using the web browser, as I mentioned just now, highly used for placing orders, for tracking orders, for making purchases and payments. And as I mentioned earlier, chat apps, the use of that for any of these use cases is still relatively low by comparison to the other channels, but it is building. And I expect that, that's going to grow over time and certainly grow over the next 36 months. On the other hand, we're seeing SMS use declining for most use cases, but relatively slowly.
It sounds like things are changing from more of a one-way simple notifications and things in that nature to a more of a enabling two-way exchanges. But then again, email is still there, as we talked about, and people are doing many transactions on it. And we also talked about this whole omnichannel and what is really meaningful for brands to really provide to satisfy their customers. And I think it all breaks down into, well, actually, let me ask you that question. How should they be even approaching this when choices are many?
Yes.
And your resources are limited.
I know.
And your customers are changing. Is there a way to look at this in a little more informed way before start just adding random channels to their communications?
Yeah. No, I would strongly, sort of advise or suggest that brands, I guess, need to look at their customer base and their demographics. They need to look at the reach that the particular communications channel has into those customer bases. So I think there are probably four main things that brands need to look at. I think they need to look at the urgency with which they need to reach their customers, or how urgent it is that they need to move to add a communications channel. They need to take into consideration what their resources are to invest in adding these different communications channels. They need to consider whether they have the technical expertise within the organization, not only to add the communications channel, but also to man it. If you've got customer service agents, you need to train those up to be able to use, say, for example, a web chat capability, or a communications app capability. And then again, as I kind of just almost mentioned, whether the channel is a good fit for the organization in terms of, do they, how many of their customers actually use it? What is the reach of a particular channel? One of the challenges I think that communications apps, or that deploying a customer interaction capability via communications apps has, is that in some markets, the penetration of different apps is fragmented. As I mentioned in the earlier podcast, in markets like Australia and the UK or the US, for example, you've got maybe 30 or 40% using Facebook Messenger, 30 or 40% using WhatsApp, and the rest using iMessage, or another combination of apps. So as a business, that's how do you actually go towards enabling interaction with all of your customers across all of those apps. So these are all the things, and I guess it's you need to be able to figure out how you do that.
Sounds like the opportunity is definitely there, but there are certain things that businesses have to actually think through. Do you see this as more of a trend, getting any easier with some of the cloud services, or I understand even Google has open platforms helping them develop chatbots easier, so that they can be integrated with chat apps like WhatsApp, and you have this deployment speed can be a little easier than having to actually develop in a more traditional sense. Do you see this helping how consumers are going to experience this sooner than later?
Yeah, absolutely. We see that ecosystem is definitely building. And particularly for brands to gain access to cloud-based communications, to use simple APIs in order to be able to connect communication services into their existing back-end systems. The tools are there and the services are there, and they can access them from any number of companies, as I'm sure you guys are aware. So I think, that will help bring the ability for brands in particular to access sort of, or to be able to provide different communications channels capabilities to their consumer customers. So I CPaaS technologies, WebRTC, all of these things I think will help get that into the hands of brands, and enable them to provide that omni-channel communications capability to their customers.
So we talked about some of the integrations in the back end that's needed to provide the type of communication, smooth interaction that consumers are wanting these days. But in order for companies to do that, could there be like a one picture there that we can imagine that if you hit this type of interaction with your consumers, you are pretty much using today's tool sets in a right way, and you're on your way to really winning the digitally very, very apt generation of consumers? Can you paint that picture for us?
Yeah, sure. It could look something like a supercharged version of the communications app that we have today. Because if you look at what communications apps, what chat apps can do today, they can do a lot of these communications capabilities. They can, a few of them already have commerce. To others, commerce is coming. There is content sharing between brands and consumers. So a lot of those capabilities, those interaction capabilities between consumers and brands are already possible within the communications apps that we have today. And for some, for some segments of the population, they may solely be using communications apps already to interact with their brands and service providers. For others, it will take a few more years, because we still do have, a bit of that legacy. That will be there for a while. There'll need to be a transition period, but you can see that the foundations are there. For all of that to be wrapped up into a communications app, and to enable consumers just to have one place, one app, one service that they can use to access different ways of interacting with their brand or their service provider.
That helps me to imagine what the end goal we are trying to achieve here in a more immediate future. So I thank you for that. So the picture that you just painted, which basically my interactions with brands, they all want this. But what do you think needs to really happen in the back end to make that possible?
Yeah, that is a huge question, I think, for brands and service providers, because there is an awful lot that needs to happen in that back end, in terms of having the IT systems, I guess, migrate to a different way of providing these services, and adding communications capabilities into those of their systems that are customer facing. So that's going to, I think, be quite a significant task. And as we mentioned previously, though, there are tools that are available to these companies in order to enable that. And in terms of and it's going to take a while, particularly for the bigger companies as well. But I think it's a worthwhile goal to aim for, because I think at the end of the day, what most brands and service providers want to do is to engage their customers, not only from the perspective of providing a great user experience and providing a fantastic product or service, but also on the fulfillment side as well. It's no point having both of those things, or providing a great product and service, if you're not also contributing to providing a great user experience through having all those communications pieces in place. So yeah, there's a few things that brands and service providers need to do, but worthwhile, I think.
Before I let you go, we have this little fun segment called What's on Your Phone? And I am going to ask, and you're going to have to open your personal phone and say, what are the 3 things that you use most on your phone?
Okay, so the 3 things that I use most on my phone, I've grouped them into 3 categories. Social, obviously, is right up there. Email, and then I would have to say games. So I have a game that I particularly like to play because I'm a bit of a word nerd. So I like to play Words with Friends. So those are probably the 3 main categories of apps I use most on my phone.
And I must admit that your top 3 things are most fun. I had many guests who are just saying emails and the expected business applications. So there you go. Have fun out there. And I want to, once again, thank you for joining and sharing your thoughts and research findings on our show.
Thank you, Jean. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you again to Pamela Clark-Dickson for joining us the past 2 episodes. You can find out more about Pamela and Ovum at ovum.com. To find out more about Jean and Tintech, visit tintech.com. Make sure to search for Mobile Interactions Now in Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found, and click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Tintech, thanks for listening.